Before we do anything, I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement. The Visions and Voices program acknowledges that USC was built on the sacred land of the Tongva people nation. We honor the Tongva and all Indigenous people, past, present, and future, and their continued survival and contributions to our society. Okay, so welcome to the first of two Visions and Voices events tonight. I'm Curtis Fletcher, the director of the Ahmanson Lab at USC Libraries. And what we'd like to do for you all in this first session before tonight's panel is to showcase an immersive digital project that was built out specifically for this event. The project, titled The Path Ahead, is essentially a 3D and VR interactive game-like experience that attempts to visualize the effects of words and ideology and the choices that they represent on California's physical and social environment in the future. So the project that you're going to see tonight was, thoughtfully kind of conceived and designed and structured by a team of 5 students whom you'll hear from. Those students were guided by the project director, Erik Loyer, who you'll also hear from. Over about a 7-month period, I think we started roughly in around October, and then the project was developed, which is to say kind of coded and programmed and actually fabricated by Loyer and Ahmanson Lab staff in the last, I would say, 2 months or so. So, a lot of thought and interdisciplinary research and design thinking and overall kind of collaborative effort has gone into this project. And so we're really excited to show it to you tonight. So tonight we're going to be providing you with a pretty extensive walkthrough of the project, over Zoom. But it's also available for download, so you all can go and play it on your own Mac or PC or even in VR. Using an Oculus Rift or Quest that's connected to a PC. And I'll paste the link for the downloads into the chat in a few moments. So I think what I would like to do is just introduce the students who were part of the team and will be speaking to you tonight about the project. And then I will turn it over to the project's director, Erik Loyer, to talk about the kind of the background and the process of the project in more detail. So tonight, you'll hear from, though not in this particular order, Alan Hosea Bexton, who is majoring in cinema and media studies with a minor in screenwriting, Landon Green, a major in health and human sciences, as well as forensics and criminality, Cameron Roper, whose major is in creative writing, Sophie Shack, who's pursuing a bachelor's in arts, technology, and business of innovation, and Kevin Yin, whose major is in media arts and practice, also with a minor in screenwriting. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn things over to Erik Loyer, who is the director of this project. Erik is a creative technologist and software artist who works in the fields of digital storytelling, digital art, and the digital humanities. He was recently an Annenberg Innovation Lab Civic Media Fellow, and his works have been commissioned by the Whitney Museum of Art, American Art, LACMA, and the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and I'm proud to say, longtime colleague that I've worked with for years and years.
Thank you, Curtis. And thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to have this opportunity to share what we've been working on with you and what the students have been putting together. So I'm going to share my screen for a moment, just to talk a little bit about how this project came to be. So as you can see from the subtitle from our call, it's visualizing ideology and environment. And really this idea of many of the things that shape our environment start life as words, and then they proceed to have all of these effects on society, on the world around us. But how can we visualize those effects in creative ways and hopefully in poetic ways? And one of the things that was kind of a guiding light as we were putting this project together were this quote by Maya Angelou, Words are things, I'm convinced. Someday we'll be able to measure the power of words. I think they are things. I think they get on the walls, they get in your wallpaper, they get in your rugs, in your upholstery, in your clothes, and finally into you. And so that was, really, even though we found this quote after started coming up with the project, it really seemed to kind of fit with what we were trying to explore, which is really an experiment in communication. Can actual three-dimensional words, dimensionalized words, help us to creatively and poetically visualize the effects of ideology on the environment? And we're doing this, of course, in the context in this evening's event of Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower, which has, of course, proved very resonant with some of the experiences that we as people living in California are having right now, seeing the effects of climate change, seeing social injustice, and how all those things are intersecting right now. And so to ground ourselves as we started this work in Butler's perspective, we invited Ayanna Jameson, one of the panelists for tonight, a Butler expert and founder of the Octavia E. Butler Legacy Network, and Linnell George, a journalist and essayist who just published a really wonderful book on Butler called A Handful of Earth, A Handful of Sky, that goes deep into her materials that are at the Huntington Library. And so the students got to ask these two experts on Butler questions about her perspective on Los Angeles and Southern California. And a lot of the insights that we got from that meeting went into the early thinking about the project. So over the fall semester and then really picking up this year, we engaged in a design process about how to use a 3D environment, interactivity, dimensionalized text, current events, and future projections, and how to make this an impactful experience for users where users can, even despite the seriousness of the subject matter, play with various outcomes and see the effects that obtain in both Southern California and in the larger environment. So I'd like to show a document that arose as part of our design process. This was done in a piece of software online called Miro, that's collaborative diagramming software. And this is where we really started working out the different topics that the students wanted to tackle, what words were going to be associated with those topics. So you can see as we zoom in on these different subjects, the students have come up with different words that kind of represent various approaches, ideological approaches to each of these topics, whether it's agriculture, whether it's construction and preservation, transportation, things like that. And then seeing how all those choices, those options that'll be available to the player or the user can contribute to how the project ends. So the project has multiple endings. And this is something that the students wanted to implement as a way for the user to really see what are the possible effects of different approaches to these topics at hand. A lot of these endings were inspired by a paper that the students came up with or found that describes these kind of 4 potential outcomes by the year 2050 that look at intersections of social conditions and planetary health, and how those can result in different possible roads that we may find ourselves on as a society. So really the best way to show you what the students have been working on is actually to demo the project itself. So let's go ahead and start the demo. All right. So the project, as Curtis mentioned, is called The Path Ahead. And the central metaphor of the piece, I'm actually going to restart my share just to make sure that we're getting the best quality here. And to make sure that we're getting sound. There we go. Okay. So, and feel free to let me know, fellow panelists, if anything's going awry with the audio as far as loudness. So, as Curtis mentioned, the project's called The Path Ahead. And the central metaphor that we're dealing with in the project is really this sense of a road, a path towards the future, and where that might lead us. So as we launch the project.
A little louder.
A little louder?
Oh, no, a little quieter.
A little quieter, okay.
Perfect.
Excellent. Okay. Oh, one more time. Okay. So we find ourselves on a path. And before that, we're prompted with some text. Our impact on the climate is all around us, even if we don't see it immediately. The decisions you make today will affect the world tomorrow. There's instructions about how to navigate the world, and instructions telling us that each set of objects that you see in the world represent an important system or institution in our society, each with their own interlocking and sometimes contradictory ideologies. So we'll be able to grab ideas from those objects, plant them in the world, and see what occurs as a result. But time is short. We only have until 2100. So we need to make the right decisions to build the future that we want to inhabit. So we find ourselves on a path here in a kind of facsimile of the Los Angeles basin. That topography and the distance that you see is actually based on real topographical data from the LA basin. We're kind of looking at a very desolate version of the Hollywood Hills coming north. And as we move forward in this world, one of the things we notice immediately is the current year is advancing. So as we move forward in space, we're also moving forward in time. So I can speed up the pace here and we can move faster. And we'll start to see words coming towards us. And all these words were chosen, written by the students, describing really the negative outcomes and kind of dystopian outcomes that potentially await us in the future. And eventually we can go so far forward that we run off the road here and just end up in a kind of desert wilderness as the sun sets on our future. But luckily, at this point, all is not lost. We can turn around and head back the way we came. The sun will rise again. And we'll have an opportunity to explore these different topics that the students have selected and make choices that could result in different outcomes from the one that we just experienced. We'll head back to the central area here. And you notice in this main staging area that there's some questions or some ideas that are floating in the air here over these objects: how we buy, how we move, how we grow, how we build, and how we preserve. So what we're going to do now is let the students actually walk you through these topics, describing the context, why they chose them, the different options that are available, and the potential outcomes. So let's start with how we buy. Cameron, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was really interested in the rise of Amazon, basically. Amazon has become essential in the functioning of today's society, not only because of the ease, affordability, and accessibility of delivery, but also because of the global pandemic, which made it that much harder to leave the house. I remember last semester we would order the Amazon Fresh. There would be a knock on the door within 2 hours. And in the seconds it would take me to open the door, the Amazon van would already be zooming away to their next delivery. This is amazing. It's really cool for me and for consumers and for people with disabilities who need these kinds of services in order to function in society. There's also like so many unthought of consequences to this speed and ease. First, there's the climate impact of limitless delivery, increased carbon emissions, increased packaging waste, the waste of unwanted returns that are often thrown away. But second, there's also human rights violations in these warehouses that prioritize customer satisfaction over worker safety. The compiled data of injury rates in Amazon warehouses throughout America states that 9.6% of workers suffered a serious work-related injury. And that's only counting what is considered a serious injury. And this was only in 2018 before the pandemic even occurred. A quick Google search would also bring up many personal stories from warehouses across the country, stories of injury, breakneck speeds, limited bathroom breaks, not to mention job loss, slow-paced job loss because of injury, slow-paced working, and missed quotas. While Amazon is the biggest culprit, a lot of these stories come from other major distributors as well, indicating that this is a symptom of a society, economy, and consumer populace that values efficiency over safety. California is trying to address this with the passage of AB 701, which requires more employer transparency on quotas and in the hiring process, and prevents quotas from taking away from meal, bathroom, and safety breaks. While this is a step in the right direction, it doesn't address ravenous consumer habits, environmental impact, or the lack of resources employees may have to take, or the lack of resources employees may have to take legal action to enforce this law. Not all of the responsibility for moral perfection falls on the consumer. It can. We don't always have the time to research the consequences of our Amazon order or consumer choice. But at the same time, we participate in the amplification of values that shape society in ways that have consequences for actual human beings and for the planet. So the choice here is meant to show how an intentional shift in values due to awareness can make an impact and force change and visually represent the consequences of each choice. Some of the words on here are supposed to represent the two different options, where one valuing worker safety, but also slowness, and then one valuing speed, but with less worker protections. Yeah.
Thank you, Cameron. And so what the way the program works is that by gathering those words that Cameron was referring to, we can actually take them into the world and plant them in specific spots and thereby affect what's happening. So we've planted, in this case, the words that are related to prioritizing efficiency, affordability, being able to get whatever we want whenever we want it. And that's had a negative impact on the environment. It's caused the sun to go down more quickly. You can see in the upper right, there are certain values of empathy, equality, and habitability that are affected by everything that we do. And those are shifted each time that we plant something new in the world. So we've had an effect by taking both of these options and planting them in the world. So in some ways, they're kind of canceling each other out, but we can go ahead and exacerbate that by taking this and planting it further. So now we've got two versions of the prioritizing efficiency and affordability that are negatively impacting. And we can see in the upper right, empathy and equality and habitability have all gone down. These are the three main values that the students have chosen to represent the state of the world. And so as we make choices and take these words and plant them in the environment, those variables will get affected. So I'm gonna go ahead and reset the game here, and let's talk about how we preserve. Kevin.
Awesome. Yeah. So my object here is representative of Little Tokyo. There's this fight that's been going on for a couple of years for the community to maintain control of First Street North, Mangrove, and the Metro Regional Connector Station, which are the last 3 blocks of land in Little Tokyo that actually belongs to the community. The initial idea for this was I was researching like ecological restoration in green urban planning and how that often comes at odds with low-income housing and low-income communities, and the bias that's kind of gets set there for who gets sustainable planning. And in the context of LA, I ended up pivoting a little bit, and I found sustainable Little Tokyo. And with Little Tokyo, there has been a lot of gentrification and influx of new occupants coming in, and a lot of the remaining Japanese American population are senior citizens. And basically, when land gets put up for sale, a lot of times like a company will come in and they'll try to like gentrify the area with like luxury condos, trendy shops and clubs, things like that. And there has been sort of a battle between the community and with appealing to the council to let them maintain control. So in terms of the choices we make, we have 3 options. One, of course, industry focused, which would include that gentrification and sort of that emphasis on income flow. Then there's another option for historical bias in terms of like preserving the historical nature of Little Tokyo that we already have there, even if that means, you know, keeping it as it is in terms of like how sustainable it is, and the emphasis is just preserving the history and what's already there. And then the third option, which I found when researching the sustainable Little Tokyo project, is actually doing construction there, but on the terms of the community, and having urban planning that incorporates sustainability and promotes businesses that already exist there rather than new businesses, and trying to maintain this community and the arts and this culture that exists in Little Tokyo while still stepping forward towards a more sustainable future.
Excellent, thanks, Kevin. And so we're taking these different three options. The one that we just planted was the preservation option, basically keeping things as they are. We have another option that's focused on maximizing the economic development. And so that results in a neon sign that says economy that has impacts on our variables as well. And then we have our third option here, which is focusing on this new mode of development that integrates, doesn't keep things as they are, but focuses also on sustainability while trying to kind of strike a balance between those. And we see we were headed down a darker path, and then we actually got to restore some of the sunlight and some of the greenery around by choosing some of those options. All right, I'm going to restart again here. And let's talk about transportation. Sophie.
Hi, yes. So I chose to do transportation. As inhabitants of LA, the drone of cars, the smog that clouds the sky, and the very questionable air quality meter on the weather app is nothing new. Yet when I came here for the first time for school, it certainly stood out to me, and the statistics do too. In California, I am sure actually that transportation is the leading source of air pollution, and 33% of all of LA's greenhouse gases come from cars, trains, and ships that are around the city. The frequent sunny days, as well as the low rainfall, contribute to high levels of particles and dust that poison our land and our lungs. So currently, the LA Metro has proposed a multi-billion-dollar budget to improve these numbers, but authorities have cut it down this year. They haven't taken into account all of the people who are actually fighting for the planet. They haven't taken into account their needs, and ultimately, we haven't gotten very far, and pollution still is a huge problem in LA. So the hope is that in the future, authorities will prioritize this need, but it's definitely an ongoing battle. So ultimately, I chose to demonstrate this through this really cool heap of cars falling from the sky, and the movement and aesthetic kind of emphasizes just the kind of destruction that these cars are causing. So one of the options that I chose was this one. You can see the words are mandate, regulate, sustainable. This is a world where regulation and authoritarian forces kind of work for the planet. So I imagine if you select this option, a metro would be a required mode of transportation for all. It would be completely carbon neutral, but there would be a sacrifice of our connection with the land. Another option that I chose was, I don't know if it's going to switch. Oh, here we go. It includes words such as harmony, progress, symbiosis, and this one was a world that is very, where the environment and people are very in harmony with one another, and communities have become provisioned with lush pathways where humans on bikes and walking can coexist with wildlife. And finally, the last option is kind of where we've been headed as a human race, where car companies are thriving, the transportation industry is proliferating, but we're definitely working toward producing the fastest, most powerful cars that continue to spew pollution and terror upon the land.
So we'll show examples of planting some of these options here. Got the one prioritizing power, and the kind of status quo. Now we'll pick up the option related to more mandated green policies, including mass transit. And so each time one of these ideas is planted from any of the topics, there's text that comes up after you planted that kind of tells you the results of what you've done and how they affect things. So as you kind of start exploring all these different options, we'll grab our third one here. You start to see that they interact in different ways, in complex ways, and sometimes contradictory ways. So, you know, as is true in the real world, these are difficult problems to solve. And here's one that's focusing more on cycling, bike paths, and that approach. Right. Thank you, Sophie. All right, let's go to Landon, how we grow.
Hi, everyone. Some of the things that inspired me in creating these pieces and these objects and thinking about these different ideologies is the increased corporatization of agriculture that we've been seeing, the increased monopolization, especially because 4 companies own 60% of all seed production in the world. And that kind of limits our ability to have diverse and nutrient-rich crops that can be sustainable for the future and could potentially protect us from environmental disaster and that we might see in the future. And then I've also been inspired by the ideas that in the ways that we've been disconnected with our food and how some people are trying to renew that connection, such as Ron Finley of the Gangster Gardener and the urban gardening movement that's happening in LA, which is super duper cool. And then also like solar punk and really trying to imagine the ways in which a future that is symbiotic with nature and how we incorporate green and crop growing into all of our infrastructure. So those are some of the things that I've been inspired by. And currently, like what I've been seeing, it's broken down into 3 different types of systems or groups of objects and groups of words. One of them is GMO or genetically modified organisms or bioengineering. The other is organic. And then the final one is like current corporatization, where we're kind of headed. And so currently what we're seeing right now is corporate agribusiness is booming, but control of seed and chemical production means lack of biodiversity, and continued soil and water degradation. Food is cheaper though, which makes it more accessible, especially for low-income communities who don't have access to good foods. It becomes a lot more accessible. And consumers really appreciate that. But then on the other hand, like organic is a lot more expensive for the consumer. And it also provides us with an opportunity to protect soil and water systems. And then it goes a little bit beyond organic and thinking about the ways in which we can create entire ecosystems in our agricultural systems to be a little bit more sustainable. And then the final one, bioengineering, is another protective tool that we could potentially use in the future to respond to the changing climate. But there's been a lot of fear and mixed messaging around bioengineering and its potential effects on human health. And I really focused on some of the objects that we see when we plant. So for example, one of them is a giant ear horn with a lock through it that's supposed to represent this kind of fear of this. You see some of these words, these mutated, this frankenfood, and the potential effects they have on human health. And then there's a lock through it just because, like I said, the corporatization and monopolization of our seed production. And then a couple of other objects like a bee is really important. Just like the phrase "save the bees" has become so emblematic of our attempt to integrate ourselves with nature and focus on entire ecosystems as opposed to just individualized acts of farming. And then also I wanted to include a human component. So one of the objects is also a fertilizer bottle. There's been a ton of lawsuits in California specifically related to how fertilizer is causing causing pregnancy issues for migrant farm workers. And that's really important, especially in California when 75% of California farm workers are undocumented. and they pay for it with their time and their health and their lives. So it's sort of the things that inspired me for this project.
Thanks, Landon. Yeah, here's an example of the Roundup bottle. We saw the corn with the lock kind of representing engineered by engineered foods. And we have the bee as well, which you saw floating around in there. And now this one's actually keeping track of some of the changes in the environment. So now we see Roundup bottles kind of floating in the mix here along with the other things. And we saw bees before, depending upon the state of things. One thing that also occurred while Landon was speaking was we reached an ending. So that's one of the 4 endings. And there's text that describes basically what's happened. It's prose that's written by the students to describe kind of one of the possible outcomes, the 4 possible outcomes. So definitely as you play the piece, keep an eye out for the different endings that are possible as you make different choices. And then our last object here, let's hear from AJ, how we build.
Hello, everybody. Yes, I'm Alan Josiah, AJ. I was interested very much in the way that we deal with land. I'm from Southern California, Bakersfield specifically, and my relationship with land since I was born and raised there my entire life was very interesting. And so to start moving away and exploring kind of natural landscapes and environments that have been traditionally indigenous and now are owned by the government, both protected or otherwise, were kind of the things I was thinking about when trying to understand how to express this ideology and how to deal with it coming into the future. So I also thought specifically about the 4 different endings that we have. So we have one that's very protected, but to a degree that is overprotective, and our connection to the environment is still kind of exclusionary. We also have ways that are a little bit more pollutive, so urban development as well as resource extraction. And the last one more focused again on indigeneity and ideas of colonization and neocolonization. So one of the first things that I wanted to point out was the US in general owns 28% of all of the land mass that we have, and California specifically has 45.7, as you can read here, of their land owned by the government. So one of the things that I thought about specifically is land that may be developed that is still natural, that is unadulterated or at least protected to some degree, and how necessarily protecting it won't essentially solve some of the issues we're dealing with, especially with indigenous equity, as well as environmental protection overall in the long term. So I was also very much interested in trying to understand how homelessness and anti-homelessness kind of work in this environment too. So again, I mentioned urban development a little bit. So being able to use land that is presently not developed, but also moving outward from there and creating space for there to be new homes. And otherwise, while it might seem like a good idea, a lot of the time is just not affordable for many people in places. And investing in marginalized and essentially impoverished communities isn't fixed by doing that. And some of the other things, obviously resource extraction. There's a lot of environmental damages and permanent destruction that ends up being caused by that, and also being specifically from Bakersfield. We have some of the most oil in the United States in general, billions of dollars in terms of the industry, and then agriculture much in the same way. So for those that aren't familiar, a lot of the Central Valley was a very lush, very biodiverse landscape prior to our colonization of the area, both between there being lots and lots of water, swamps, not swamps, I'd say more of like a alluvial space, both for different flora and fauna. And over time, since those places have been turned into agricultural hubs, into oil derricks and otherwise, I grew up in a space that was a man-made desert essentially. So my thoughts were 2 spaces that were either resource extraction and urban development, because Bakersfield's also one of the fastest growing cities within the United States, as well as both environmental protection and then also being able to give reparations to indigenous people. So my thought between those other 2 is we might have some space to protect the land, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we're giving any protections to the people within it. So while it might seem we're adding more to our biodiversity and otherwise within the United States, it's not really adding to the equity nor culture that surrounds Southern California, which for the most part has been overshadowed by a lot of these mega corporations developers and otherwise. So as you can see, like this one right here, neocolonialism, rare elements, profitable. I had mountain infringement. Those are very much surrounded around resource extraction and ways that the land has been sold off. And there's been a lot of contemporary issues going on with that towards the end of the Trump administration, which have been rescinded for the most part, I think largely over in Alaska. And then in terms of the urban development side, I was kind of touching base and thinking about the way that even, homesteading was something that, was abolished back in, I think it was 1974 or so. So the space that is used, that is public land, isn't necessarily open to the public because either socioeconomic and or cultural beliefs will keep people from being able to explore it and be able to enjoy that as an intimate part of our society, as well as Southern California overall. And so the last one that I thought about most would again be the indigeneity and kind of the reparations that are surrounded with it. Because being able to decolonize a lot of the lands that we have not only offers space for, again, as you can see, generational wealth to these communities, rejuvenation to the land, because Indigenous peoples are very much interested in the preservation as well as the stewardship of that over time. And then finally, being able to have an intersection, an education, and a deeper understanding of culture for the Indigenous peoples that we have now essentially settled for the past few centuries. So yeah, those were my thoughts to kind of work behind everything.
Great, thanks, AJ. And these similarly have effects if we go and plant them. This is a later edition, so we didn't get the chance to include all the objects. We have placeholders in here for now, but they still function in terms of how they affect the world. So we can plant here and we'll see our empathy, equality, and habitability, in this case, going up quite a bit for all those values on the reclaiming indigeneity. And you might notice as those values increase towards the positives, that the world gains more color. So it starts out a little bit kind of grayed out, and the colors become brighter, starts to feel more like the classical Southern California sunny day, as opposed to the way that we started out, and of course the kind of darker situations that we can find ourselves in depending upon the other choices that we make. So that kind of basically gives you a sense of the topics that the students have explored, the writing that they've done to support those topics. You can go in and explore, and there's more information as you go through and learn about each one of these moments, and pull the words from them, plant them in the world, see the effects they have, and then also once we reach an ending to actually see what the four possible endings are, some positive, some negative. So I think with that, we can open it up to any questions or thoughts that folks have about the students, the way they work, the way this process came together, and how the piece developed.
Patty, are we taking questions by chat only? Is that how it works with the webinar?
Yes, the chat's open if people want to ask questions there.
Well, while people are thinking of questions, maybe I'll take my prerogative and ask a question of the students.
We've got a question for AJ, I think.
Yeah, let's take that one first.
Whose phone is ringing? Hello, Josh. So no, actually it was not. I am very interested to see what that is precisely. It was more inspired both again by my own personal investment and youth growing up in Bakersfield. There was also a lot of Indigenous communities I was a part of in terms of powwows and understanding, again, the land, being able to understand the stewardship and the values behind it. And also more specifically, I took a Mesoamerican Cosmovision course, which touched a lot on kind of the history and deep culture and civilization that had existed within Mesoamerica, but also which to explain is what's modern day Central America for the most part, and also how that moved upward into the rest of North America, and obviously also downward into the rest of South America. And towards the end of that, we understand the values that go around a lot of these cultures for millennia, and also how colonization, for the most part, erased them, as well as the accomplishments, as well as much of the modern indigenous cultures that still exist, but aren't often taught about, nor recognized when thinking about reparations, nor giving back to the communities that have been displaced. So yeah, that's kind of where I was inspired by.
Okay, so another question, I think, mostly for the students. How might this awesome project, thank you for that, connect to actionable steps towards urgent change? Who wants to take that one?
That's the question of the day, isn't it? Well, it's at least for me personally, it's a hard question for like a lot of art that's sort of like meant to like discuss and talk about social change and like, or like social environmental injustice. And it's like, well, what do we do past conversation, right? And at least for me personally, it's sort of like a hope that like when we have this visualization in front of us, when we have these sort of instances, we and people who like play this can walk away sort of having a better understanding of sort of the text around us and how this slow crawl of apocalypse that we've sort of brought upon ourselves. Yeah, just like interpreting critically and trying to like work with legislation and the texts that define our futures. I guess hopefully this sort of thing would inspire someone to at least interact more critically with that sort of environment.
Something we talked about a lot when working on this project was how these are such complicated issues where there's no one right answer or way to deal with them. And so I don't have an answer to your question about like actionable steps towards urgent change, but at least for me, my hope with this project was that it would show every angle, like as many angles as we could of the issues that we're talking about, and inspire people to think more deeply and to know that there are more angles of every issue than even we brought up here and in life in general. Yeah.
That was one question that the students surfaced repeatedly in design discussions was, how to make this not easy, not an easy experience, not to just go around and, oh, I know to pick all the quote unquote right things. And, that's all I can do. And so, providing these different alternatives for how you can approach these different issues, some of which you may have conflicting feelings about. Some are maybe very clear to you, but others may cause you to stop and think for a little bit about what is the right approach and how does it interact with all the other approaches that we see. Is something that came up repeatedly as something that was important to the students to foreground.
I was going to add real quick as well. We also had very ambitious goals, and just because of time constraints, we didn't get to them, but we would have had a lot more options. And I think of a far further journey that a lot of people would have to go on and make those choices that would hopefully encourage more change in more specific ways.
So there's a couple more questions that we should have time to get to. The next one it asks, how did each of you get involved in the project and how did you decide which areas of climate to focus on? So it's kind of a two-part question. Why don't I take the first part? So this project, this kind of year-long team-based project is part of a set of programs that we have at the Ahmanson Lab. They're called collaboratories. We run about 2 or 3 each year. This year we ran 3 of them. This was one of them. And essentially what we do is we bring faculty and students and artists like Erik Loyer together to kind of tackle some interdisciplinary topic by way of building out and fabricating some kind of often immersive digital piece of research output, essentially. And so what we do is at the beginning of the year, we kind of make a call for faculty and others to propose these types of projects. And then we put out a call for the students to join them. In this case, we put out a call in, I think, August or September for the students to join. We got a ton of applications, but these were the 5 students that we chose, given their background, given their interest in the topic. So that's how they're kind of brought into this particular project. Who wants to talk about which areas they focused on and how they decided to do so?
I feel like I mentioned this a little bit in my presentation, but I wanted to focus on Amazon because that has such a obvious impact on environment and on human rights and social justice. And I think it's impossible to talk about environment or social justice without talking about the other one. And it seemed like the most tangible way to go about addressing both of those options.
I can go next. So for me, I spent most of my time during the pandemic on a farm in Oklahoma, where I'm originally from. And so it got me really, like, with time to settle, with time to think, it really got me thinking about our relationship with the environment, and also just trying to connect myself back to a history that I didn't know, kind of a global, more larger story of agriculture, given that my family has a history in farming and I didn't know a lot about it. So I think that's why I was drawn to the idea of how we grow, just to try and connect the personal with the national and global. Yeah.
Go next. Oh.
Sure, go ahead, Sophie.
Okay, just real quick. I chose transportation because at home, I live in Connecticut. It's very suburban and like naturey, and just the juxtaposition between that world and when I came to Los Angeles was very apparent to me, and I could like easily find a way to visualize this and demonstrate this in a virtual world. So I wanted to like kind of, I know it's like very normalized here in Los Angeles, but just putting these objects and these concepts in the like right in the face of the audience and making them really like scrutinize the problems that are all around them and kind of like a normal way of life is, I thought that was like a really important thing to do. So yeah.
Great. I think it's a perfect segue to the next question. In fact, you've already sort of partly answered it, which is and it's a very big picture question. What was the process like taking these high concept ideas and finding a way to express them in a virtual space? Essentially the question behind the entire project. What was it like doing that?
I think it was definitely very interesting early on, because a lot of this was like, we were talking about text and our interaction with text, and we're like, well, how do we make text visual? And how can we really think about using this virtual space to do it? Let's see, for mine, for instance, it's since these are all rooted in like real life sort of situations and conflicts, it was really easy to just kind of like settle back on like, oh, well, here's like an object, or here's just like, originally I just wanted to do, well, look, we can just do a block, like a city block, because that's what I read about. And then we were like, well, we can try to go more representational, more conceptual. And I think you can definitely see that in things like Sophie's like infinite cars, and like the floating fruit bowl for Landon's thing. And I think we pivoted a little bit more towards these bigger, more like expressionist sort of representations that were really interesting in the virtual space. And also the time mechanic and just movement in it was really elevated sort of by the VR, or not the VR, just by the experience.
For myself, I was going to say, because again, Kev mentioned this a little bit, that we are referencing Octavia Butler's book, Peril of the Sower, and I thought about specifically what she says is God is change. So what is it that is changing? What is it that we have now, and how will we change that? As well as being respectful that the audience is an active member within this change, and how do we end up having them both not only see, but can feel the ways that those actions are moving in the environment, and also, as Kev said, over time, those constraints, as well as the three different empathy, equitability, and habitability that we have going on. So we can gauge kind of what is going on and what is happening as we move forward.
For me, the process was really fascinating because I got to see like this tiny concept, this tiny like string of words that was just like the task that we were trying to complete. Like this whole pipeline of ideation, of brainstorming to this full-fledged VR experience was like really cool to see, especially working with so many people from different backgrounds. So in terms of the process for me, it was very long. There were a lot, we met every week, and there were definitely moments where like none of us knew what to say, none of us had any ideas, but there were also moments where we all had ideas and we were all like contributing to the conversation. So I thought that it was an amazing experience to be a part of.
That's what we want to hear at the lab. Wonderful. I want to move on to the next question, which is a pretty specific one. How does the black text that's kind of emanating from the future, they aren't related to the, how we buy and how we preserve text, how does it relate to the experience or the flow towards dystopia and utopia?
I'll jump in on that one. That actually was one of the first ideas the students came up with for trying to figure out what to do with text in the space, was this idea of a kind of word smog, that as we advance kind of more into the future, that it starts to become more and more prevalent, and it just basically we become bombarded with all these words. And they were really, from the ones that the students chose, kind of more general, negative sentiments about where we are and where we might be going. This is a part that's actually especially powerful in VR, to actually go into the darkness, into the desert with the years ticking by and seeing all these words kind of falling, coming towards you in this way. So that was one of the first kind of text concepts that everybody seemed to really gravitate to when it came up in one of the meetings.
All right, so I know there are other questions, but we actually need to be mindful of the fact that everyone needs to, as advanced as we all are with Zoom at this point, we need to allow for some time for folks to jump over to the panel. So unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to everyone's questions, but we really appreciate your interest in this project and the process behind it. So thanks everyone for coming. I just want to say thanks for everyone involved in the project. It was just wonderful watching it come to fruition. I really second Kevin when I say I love that it ended up with, I think, this perfect balance between realism and kind of impressionism. Like it's somewhere in between, and it makes for a really, really compelling experience, I think. I love this project.
Thank you, everyone.
I'd second that. Just a wonderful experience working with the students and all the creativity and thoughtfulness that they brought to it. Thanks everybody for coming.